won't bore you to death in a church. That will be wrong. We've got a hard act to follow after the previous amazing session. Welcome to the Franschhoek Literary Festival. This is the elections discussion. As we sit here, our compatriots abroad are voting. I'm not sure how many of you, but I got photos from family members and friends queuing in London. There's a massive queue in London. Also elsewhere, so that's a good start. That's positive, right? People want to vote. I hope all of you are going to vote. If you're not going to vote, you can't be my friend. My name is Adriaan Basson, Editor-in-Chief of News24 and co-author of Who Will Rule South Africa with Qaanitah Hunter. Next to me, Qaanitah Hunter, well-known political journalist. Also joining us on the panel today is Mr. Justice Malala, who needs no introduction, political commentator, author, journalist, and all-around nice guy, author of the brilliant The Plot to Save South Africa. And then Greg Mills, who publishes on average 2.5 books a year, I don't know how he does it, the director of the Brenthurst Foundation, author of Rich State, Poor State, Why Some Countries Succeed and Others Fail, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Scenarios for South Africa's Uncertain Future. That he co-wrote with Ray Hartley and Milsoka. Welcome to my fellow panelists, and thank you to all of you for joining us. One request to my fellow panelists, I was on a panel this morning, a breakfast panel, also around the state of the country and the world. At the end of the panel, a man with a desperate look on his face put up his hand and said, please give me some hope. We had to almost open the bar for him. So depressed was he. So you are not allowed to depress this audience today with your responses. You need to throw some hope in there, specifically towards the end of our discussion, because all is not lost and doom and gloom. So for the first time this year in South Africa, we have what is called a tracking poll, which is a poll that the Social Research Foundation of Franschhoek here does on a daily basis. What they do, they've got 1,800 people who they started with, they phone them every day and ask them who you're going to vote for, nationally and in the provinces. Every second day, they replace the oldest 200 members of this poll with 2 new 100 members. So it's continuously changing, and we're now on day 16 of the poll. So I think scientifically very sound and very interesting. Well, this morning, fellow panelists, the poll stood as such for our national results. The ANC, 46, tracking up. The DA, 24, tracking up. Others in third place with 9%. Which we'll talk about. The MK party, the newbie on the block, led by the old bee on the block, at 8%. The EFF at 7%, and the IFP on 5%. Let that sink in for a moment. So, Qaanitah Hunter, do these results surprise you?
Absolutely not. And I'll tell you why. Look at me clapping. It's going to get politics in elections. This is our normal chat. So I think that the ANC was tracking incredibly low in April, March and April, because the ANC's machinery was not on the ground. And one thing the ANC can do very well is campaign for elections. We can agree to that, right? So that's the first thing for me. The second thing is the others, is people are undecided. And so you're going to have a lot of people who are going to experimenting with cutting up their votes. And so that for me is consistent to the anecdotal evidence that I've experienced. The stagnation of the DA, it's not really stagnant, 2%.
Slight growth.
Yeah, slight growth. I think that's consistent
from 2019, not from 2016. 2016, they won 27%.
Yeah, so the 20, yeah, but so almost a plateau of the DA. The decline of the EFF is not shocking to me because I've witnessed that in my reportage, and it's something that we've been tracking because KZN was the base of the EFF in its growth, not in its initial base. But remember, EFF bucked the trends when it grew from 2014 to 2019. And everyone was like, okay, where is this number coming from? And it came from KZN. But if you look at the performance of just the activity of EFF in KZN, it has been quite dismal. And then obviously the emergence of the MK party. So what does it put the MK party at?
8%.
8% nationally.
Still phenomenal for a new entrant, right?
Phenomenal for a new entrant. So that puts them in the close to 30% provincially.
Yes. In fact, they're tracking over 30% in KwaZulu-Natal as well. Of course, this poll doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it is the base and the temperature we have.
Yeah.
Qaanitah, but the MK party coming in as the third largest party in South Africa. Is that possible?
Well, we're going to see what the Constitutional Court says. I'm of the view that that there is a formidable groundswell for the MK party in KZN. And where does that come from? That simply comes from ANC structures that have unmobilized and feel disenfranchised and a bit upset at South Africa today are just kind of moving along. So Jacob Zuma has no interest campaigning to you and I, right? We are not his target market. His target market is the traditional ANC voter that feels possibly using Zulu nationalism, I think, to garner that and his popularity. The other thing that I found when I went to the Constitutional Court last week, when the Constitutional Court was hearing whether he could run on the appeal of the electoral court judgment. So, speaking to people outside of court, his support base is essentially rooted in misinformation. But at the same time, I get it. Because what? My life was better under Jacob Zuma. Objectively, your life was better. Even our lives were better under Jacob Zuma, objectively, in the sense of the metric of the global economy was not as bad as it was today. The load shedding situation, okay, now it's a little bit better. But there are metrics that had nothing to do with Jacob Zuma that made life better. But also, because of Jacob Zuma, life is worse now. And how do you explain that nuance to an ordinary voter to say, listen, the reason you don't have water is not because there's a drought, but because money that was meant to maintain water infrastructure was a credit deployment piggy bank, and the Auditor General has flagged 5 billion rand on a project called War on Leaks. And so how do you explain that? How do you explain that, yes, you did have electricity under Jacob Zuma, but that's because of the corruption at Eskom and because you were burning diesel like it was no tomorrow. And that, I think, you can't rationalize with someone who's just, life is worse.
Justice Malala, the ANC in the last general election in 2019 achieved 57% of the vote under Cyril Ramaphosa. This poll puts them as 46, which I think is a good result for them in this election. What are we to make, and how significant is this moment of the oldest liberation movement in Africa that's been in charge of South Africa for 30 years, dipping below, likely dipping below the 50% majority mark?
Thanks, Adriaan. I think it's great. It's fantastic. And it's great for our democracy. We are a normal, well, not kind of normal, competitive democracy. And hooray for that. We didn't have a civil war. We didn't have to, it's a nice transition from one-party domination to multi-party competition. And we don't know who's going to be running this place in 2 weeks' time. It's fantastic. It really is. So that's the good news. Can I just come to a point Qaanitah was making? Such the amazing point. I was wondering, though, about Jacob Zuma and that 30% in KZN. I think one aspect of it is that a failure of leadership leaves a vacuum.
100%.
And so what you've seen in KwaZulu-Natal is the mayor of eThekwini saying to the July 2021 rioters, yeah, go and da-da-da. And people start saying, oh, but we had better leadership and maybe they were rioting at the time because of Jacob Zuma and so forth. And I think the ANC walked away from leadership in KwaZulu-Natal in particular. And Jacob Zuma is just walking in. He plays big man politics. I will do this for you. Give me 6 months to clean up this place. I'm sending pregnant girls, and he says nothing about the boys, but I'm sending pregnant girls to Robben Island and blah, 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 and that kind of thing. Which, in a way, and maybe we need to have this discussion, these voters for Jacob Zuma and for MK, and to say MK party, for me, is a bit of a misnomer, even though we use it. It's a Jacob Zuma party. It's the cult of the personality. It's the man himself. And so this zombieism of these voters It's extraordinary. And to think that we're talking about an 8% take, that's as much as COPE got in 2009. I think it was 7-point-something% for COPE. That is a big number. And I think it tells us something, and I'm not sure what it is, but about the electorate and perhaps the feeling of heartfulness that people have to some extent.
Just anything else. Greg Moss, I want to come to you also at the Brenda's Foundation, have your own polling that you do. Accepting that polling is flawed and that there's a margin of error. What do you make of these numbers? I mean, do they resonate for you, or do you think we can see changes, significant changes from these numbers as they stand today?
I mean, polling numbers tend to change depending on your methodology and obviously depending on the timing. We did 3 polls over an 18-month period, and they were actually quite consistent. I mean, underneath the headlines, and obviously it depends on how you look at this, and different political parties take different things out of them. I mean, I think the first thing is how much the ANC's support has fallen by. To some extent, it's been eaten into by MK, but also the EFF has been eaten into by MK. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is the DA is the only party to get a greater slice of the vote than it had in the last election, which I think was 20.7, if I recall correctly. Yeah. So 24 is a significant up as a percentage. Of course, it says other stories about the DA, but it means that I think probably that the Cape Town message is resonating. And perhaps the most interesting thing out of our poll, well, one of the more interesting things was the percentage of South Africans who thought that the Western Cape and Cape Town were the best run provinces and city in South Africa. So the answer was roughly a third. And if you think that the Western Cape has 12% of South Africa's population, Cape Town has 8% of its population, and half don't vote for the DA, that means that of 4% of South Africa's population, another 29% coming from somewhere else thought that it was the best run place. So I think that has an effect on the DA's support base. I think the smaller parties have had very little traction, and that traction seems to be falling. And I think you have to ask yourself, why? Is that just a spend? Is that just because they're coming against established brands? Is that because politics is hard work and you need a significant organizational structure behind you? And I think the EFF and MK, perhaps the RET message hasn't had as much appeal among the EFF and MK potential supporters as we thought. And to some extent, the ANC is moving to cover that base. And the NHI, of course, happened before this poll, and that is definitely a pivot to populism. I mean, I think 2 months ago, President Ramaphosa said he couldn't find his pen.
3 months ago.
3 months ago. What he was really saying was, I'll wait until the election and then I'll sign this, even if it won't actually, ever see the light of day as intended. So it's a definite populist tilt. But perhaps under all these headlines, the most interesting thing is thus, other than the coalition permutation, which I'm sure we'll get to, is in Gauteng and in KZN, as it stands, you're going to have coalition governments. And you're going to, in both, have big coalition governments, not the rats and mice coalitions that we've been used to, which are very fractious and difficult to manage. And every person who owns a party wants to be a sultan, so they're always demanding more than they really deserve. And so they're very unstable. You're going to have big coalitions. And those 3 provinces, Gauteng, the Western Cape, and KZN. And you wanted hope at the end, I'll give you hope now. Those 3 provinces are 2/3 of South Africa's GDP. And that is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of policy and governance. We have reasonable policy in this country. We have terrible governance. And that is an ANC largely responsibility. And if those 3 provinces become super coalitions, call them that, actually a different future awaits us after the 29th of May.
That's obviously not saying the MK-ANC coalition, but we'll get into this.
That's not a super coalition. That's something else. Also begins with an S.
I think someone uses the word doomsday. Qaanitah, you wanted to respond to something that Justice said, but I also want you to just talk to us a bit about the ANC support. So South Africa is not in a great space, right? I mean, pick your metric, the crime rate, the unemployment rate that came out this week, 32.9% for the kind of conservative metric. Education level, 81% of kids aged 10 can't read for meaning. It's bad stuff, okay? Yet the ANC will still be the largest party after this election. Why?
I'm going to start with something controversial. I think it's a good thing that the ANC will be the largest party, and I'll tell you why. Because, can you hear me? Okay. Now I said I'll start with something spicy. I think that the ANC will be the largest party after this election, and I think that's a good thing. Let me tell you why. You don't want political change like we've seen in the Arab Spring. It's unsustainable. Big bang politics. Gradualism is a maturation of democracy. Imagine a Liberation Party, if those numbers stand, 11% in a single election. That's huge. That's big. That's not something to be despondent about. So the days of flagrant kind of will push through controversial intelligence laws. We will sign an NHI despite 4 years of consultations that with submissions that make the case against it. That reality, as we know it, falls away, right? So it's not. We should never have this despondency that nothing's going to change. Things change if we want it to change. And the reality of it is that this was a party that sat in 2/3 majority in our lifetimes, a decade ago, a little bit more than a decade ago.
2004.
Two decades ago. That's still quite significant that it has this constant decline, that it loses metros, Johannesburg, etc., and the world doesn't shake. Jesus doesn't return.
You're in the NCHF.
Careful what we say.
But the point is that the ANC's decline is a consequence of its own making. And for me, I've been making this point consistently, AB, is that we're tracking an 11% decline for one party and we're celebrating a 2% incline for the official opposition. That's, with all of its own failures, you should have seen this large growth of an alternative.
And I want to go there, Justice, so let's assume this is the result, right? ANC 46, that's 11 percentage points drop in 5 years. That's massive. Yet, and I take Greg's point that the DA, according to this poll, is growing slightly, but there were 11% on the table to be in our, really basic analysis of these numbers. Why didn't the DA and the EFF, the number 2 and 3 parties in the last election, why didn't they manage to capitalize on that disillusioned ANC vote and bring it over?
That's really not getting it, I think. I think there's been failures on both sides. The point about the EFF, to start off, I think the EFF at an organizational level has shot itself in the foot. Julius Malema as a leader is beginning to show his deficiencies. If you think about the 10th anniversary celebrations where he was lifted up on a train and so forth, and he said to every elected leader of the EFF, you must bring a bus and I think a gazebo or something like that to Johannesburg. And in KwaZulu-Natal, many of those guys couldn't do it and they were kicked out of the party. At the moment, you have an EFF that goes to KwaZulu-Natal with Marshall, first with Floyd Shivambu, whose Zulu is not so hot, who just, doesn't resonate at all in that province. In Limpopo, he fired Josie Butano, who was his sort of right-hand man in the ANC Youth League a long time ago and was a leader there. Josie Butano marches to the ANC office with 1,000 EFF people. So organizationally, a key part of the presence of that party in those two provinces just boom, not there. So it's no wonder for me that the EFF is struggling in KZN. It's the young leadership that it had, who were councillors and so forth, are just suddenly, out in the cold. Julius Malema gets asked, why is it that Naledi Chira worked until the day she went into labor? She was pregnant.
And came back 2 months later.
And he says, well, I can't tell her to do this and so forth. I'd have been accused of being a man who dominates and so forth. This is the same person who a few weeks before had been asked about why is she being punished for telling Adriaan that I won't be present, my child, the same child is sick. I can't vote. She told someone, and it's, you're going to pay 10,000 rand, I think it was, and a gazebo, they like gazebos there, and a gazebo for not telling Qaanitah, who, it's a technicality, but it's, so you're targeting people. And I think those things are beginning to say something in the EFF. So I think the EFF, that plateau is internal, and then it's a large chunk of people who should be, in my view, voting EFF, young people, unemployed people, 64% unemployment, and he still isn't resonating with that constituency. Why? And I think they don't think everything he says can deliver what they need, and that what they need and want are jobs. So I think that's where it stopped. That said, I do think it will be interesting to see what your Gauteng numbers say. I do think the EFF in Gauteng will continue to grow. Perhaps not in Limpopo, perhaps not in KwaZulu-Natal, but I think in urban centers, there is still an EFF. The DA, I said this morning and I'll repeat it because I believe it. I think the DA just doesn't, and is not making an effort, in fact, doesn't care about the fact that liberalism is part of being Black. They don't see Black people as liberals who should be in their party. If you've got Phumzile van Dam, if you've got Mmusi Maimane, Herman Mashaba, Mampela Rampela, all this list of leaders, and you say, it's her fault, it's his fault, it's his fault. But you don't stop and say, but why is there a procession of these Black leaders, and not just at national level, at provincial level? Why is Makashile Ghana, who is probably one of the best organizers in the WAS, one of the best organizers in the DA, who's gone with Rise Mzansi now? If you don't ask yourself those questions and you just say, oh, Musi was weak, or Herman was this, and so forth, perhaps the problem is with you. And my view is that the DA is not having that conversation. So I think that's where the failure is. The DA is not breaking the racial barrier because it's not talking about it, it's not confronting it, and it cannot admit to itself that maybe we need to do something. So it's the alcoholic who won't admit, basically.
Greg, can you pick up on that? So the DA in 2019 had let's go back a bit further. So under my mind in 2016, yes, it was a local government election. You can't really compare that with national, but we have it and we have to see it. So in that election, national percentage-wise, the DA achieved 27% of the national vote under my money, then plummeted to 21 in 2019. Then there was that big intervention by the likes of Tony Leon, Ryan Coetzee, Michiel Leroux came in, my money resigned, Mashaba resigned, Steenhuisen came in, Zille came back. How do you understand their strategy and their plan in light of the criticism that Justice just articulated?
Two things. Firstly, our polls, and I can only refer to those, show that 53% of South Africans consistently blame the ANC for the circumstances that we're in. 80% of South Africans think the country's going in the wrong direction. Interestingly, only about 11%, it varies, blame apartheid. So we kind of got away from that, unsurprising perhaps, that it's been 30 years, surprising in that it's only been 30 years. But 30 years, of course, there's an entire generation, so perhaps it's more unsurprising than it is surprising. So that seems to equate with the overall figures facing the ANC, that just over half think the country is being badly run because of them, not some other issue, not an outsider, whatever. And then that means that the opposition has 46% of the vote, 53% of the vote to share between them, and the ANC gets 47% of the vote. And the DA's share is roughly half of that. Now, I don't agree entirely with Justice. I think it is, from a low base, admittedly, nationally, still the most diverse party there is, which says something about our politics. I don't think you could describe the ANC as a particularly diverse party today, and in fact, nor most of the others. It has also it's obviously confronting these welter of new parties that have been created, which take about 10% of the vote. And none of them have got any great traction, but they'll have 2 or 3 seats in parliament. And that's obviously eaten some of the remaining, so 24 plus the NPC votes, that brings you to about 33. That includes Action SA, the IFP and so on. But there's another 20% on the table. Some of that's undecided, which is a big chunk, as you pointed out, of the remaining vote. We'll have to wait and see where that goes to. But what are the reasons for it? I think, one, the Western Cape message doesn't get to a lot of South Africans, but has got to the third I've spoken about. Secondly, I do think that the DA leadership is not seen to represent the majority of South Africans. In other words, identity still matters. And I think, personally, they've gone off in a direction on certain things like cadre deployment, which I don't really see as a vote winner for them. I think people are far more prosaic in their demands. It's jobs, it's load shedding, it's corruption. Those are the 3 big issues. And of course, crime and security more generally. And they're getting into the sort of liberal minutiae rather than addressing the more fundamental issues of the day. But you would, perhaps there's a leadership change happening after this election, which might resemble more the interests of some South Africans. That's still going to be part of it. And I think finally, the ANC still has a tremendous brand. It still has an organizational machine, and that's going to carry them through this election, despite the record over the last 5 years in particular. But really, it's been 30 years of 2 halves, as I said in a session yesterday. If you looked at this as a sort of a football or rugby game, we had 13 years of reasonable government and governance. Not brilliant. Some of the seeds of what happening today was planted then. And then you had 17 terrible years, and we've really never recovered. So in spite of that, the ANC still has this formidable brand, made easier by the opposition's fracturing, infighting, inability to sell their message, and of course, the South African issue of identity, which is still very powerful.
Qaanitah, I want to start moving us to coalitions, because we are going there as a country and as a conversation today. And I want us to unpack that for the audience, because I'm sure there will be questions as well. So there's been a lot of talk, and in our book, we actually refer to the possibility of a DA-ANC coalition, right? There's been people who's been saying for a very long time that the centrists in South Africa who agree that we should be a democratic state with a constitution, free marketism, and the Bill of Rights, that includes freedom of expression, that those who believe that in the ANC and the DA should and will naturally move closer. I mean, are you seeing anything like that happening, or are you seeing a hardening of attitudes? Just in the past week, we've heard John Steenhuisen saying that the DA will do away with the minimum wage, which caused a big fallout in their relationship, or their so-called relationship with the ANC. You've had Kusatu President Losi saying on stage that she would rather now prefer an EFF coalition for the ANC because of just that statement.
Yeah. So the thing is that when you have coalitions, you have to, you can't be precious about too much, right? And that's the important thing. Now, because we've had a rodeo with coalitions at a local level, there's lots of lessons learned, right? The ANC and the EFF both were would rather not be in government than run a massive multi-party coalition, because they have. And I'll take Nelson Mandela Bay as the example. They both were the controlling coalition partner there. And it is hell to run government with 10 political parties. That's nobody's best case scenario, right? It's a best case scenario if you're Al Jamaa, because you'll become a mayor with 9,000 votes.
Or the PA.
You know, but so the rationality of two parties that has experience with governance saying, listen, we can't, like, this not, we know it's not going to work. So let's find each other on that way. That is determined on where the ANC lands. That possibility only factors if the ANC has this, not what this poll is saying. It's the extreme version, which is 40, low 40s, right? Because at 46%, the ANC doesn't need a DA deal, right?
Nationally, they may need it provincially.
Provincially, yeah. So the ANC EFF is interesting because the ANC is in coalition with the EFF. In Ekurhuleni, in eThekwini, they share power. They don't
Disastrously. But
disastrously, of course, but they don't want you to know it. They're married, but they don't. It's a secret marriage, right? And the thing is that the consequence of that is that the EFF is essentially like breaking the ANC from within. And the ANC structures who have had to deal with it, not the leadership, I'm talking about like regional structures, have seen the worst of working with the EFF. And so the appetite of that is not there. And 2 years ago, a conversation about working with the DA was probably never on the table. And the fact that it's now being entertained is an interesting one for me. My guess with coalitions, can I
Sure.
into that, is that at 46, polling at 46%, the ANC wants to push as closest to 50%. How its plan is very simple. Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Free State, get your normal voters out.
Eastern Cape.
Eastern Cape, sorry. Get the people who vote for you, get them out, right? How do you deal with the Gauteng element? We have a populist Panyaza Lesufi, so hopefully it's not going to be as dismal as anticipated, right? Your problem, Chahal, is KwaZulu-Natal because it's unpredictable. So what you do is you send your entire national election machinery to KZN, and you hope and pray that the decline of the DA in the Western Cape will not translate in votes for you in the Western Cape, but it will help your overall picture. That's the ANC's plan, right? So it's best case scenario, 50 on the mark. It's worse in their metrics. Their worst case scenario is this, the 46%. Then what do? What you do is you don't go into bed with anybody. You open up the marriage to open. Who wants to work with us in a national government for the stability of the state? You see how that's couched very differently?
Government of national unity.
Yes. And it's a word we've been hearing for a long time until President Ramaphosa spoke about it this week, which was interesting for me. A deal with the IFP is something that they want if the IFP will speak to them. But again, provincial dynamics is going to affect national dynamics. It's different dynamics, but it will have an effect. The same with the multi-party charter. The multi-party charter, I think, stands a formidable chance in KwaZulu-Natal because of the DA, the IFP. They've been working together and they've been working together really well, right? I think the MPC had a real shot in terms of support in Gauteng, but there hasn't been a strong leader in the opposition in Gauteng.
Yeah. Greg, your book, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, you outlined a lot of these scenarios, coalition scenarios. Can you just, in summary, point out what, in your view, would be a good, a bad, or ugly coalition scenario? And can you please specifically also speak to the IFP? Because they're becoming a very interesting player. I mean, it's a 5% national party with around 20% supporting KZN, but it seems like, listening to Qaanitah now and to others, that the IFP may be option number one for a coalition for the ANC that could start in KwaZulu-Natal but translate national.
I think the fourth scenario is a fistful of cents rather than dollars. But on the good, the bad, the ugly, I think, the scenarios that we're seeing are either the ANC squeaks over 50%, which you referred to, and then it'll, invite others to work with it if necessary. It feels it needs the comfort of that, or it'll sail on regardless. But it'll be a tremendous defeat for Ramaphosa. Don't make no mistake. And the knives will be out for him in the ANC at a just over 50% scenario. So that's what we're not talking about, intra-party dynamics, but let's park that to one side for a moment. If the ANC gets below 45, which I'll see as a benchmark, then, at 45, it has different options. It can take a few of the rats and mice and cobble together a just over 50% coalition scenario with the IFP and a few others. Below 45, it needs more. And essentially here, there's two options. One is the EFF MK coalition. You could say that, maybe Jacob Zuma will parlay the MK vote into the ANC to get off jail. Well, he's got off jail already, but maybe, have his sentence declared.
He's got another trial coming up.
He's got another trial. It's endless, we'll be there forever and being paid for by us. So he could do that. He could do an EFF, RET type coalition, or he could do this grand coalition with the DA. Let me just say one thing about this is none of this is going to happen unless people work for it. And no political party is going to announce this before any election, because they would be really stupid, even more stupid sometimes than I believe they are, because they would essentially be saying, vote for me, but I'm really going to go into bed with them, business with them, which is not a very clever strategy. So the methodology and timing is everything in this regard. Now, there's different schools of thought here. The one school of thought is that you need a national dialogue, and out of the national dialogue comes a government of national unity. A government of national unity is different to a coalition government.
Yeah.
A coalition government is reflective of the support that the parties received in the election. A government of national unity is kind of cherry-picked, hand-picked. You form this puzzle which looks more or less like the way you see the world. That's quite different. And there's no way, I don't think, that the DA would do a government of national unity, and I doubt very much the IFP too, although the IFP too is split. And there's definite, those who favor this and those who don't. I think VF Labis is definitely on the those who don't side. So the one school of thought is have a national dialogue, and then Cyril Pollyanna-ish stands up and says, let's create a government of national unity. It's such a warm and fuzzy thing. And this, I'm going to be the great redeemer, the great unifier of South African politics, once more of South African society, the kind of image of Mandela stuff. The other way, which is, I think, probably the only way it's going to happen, is if there is a government, if there's a coalition government created. Now, here's the interesting bit. If the ANC requires a coalition to run KZN and to run Gauteng, which seems to be, as of the moment, most likely, no one in KZN has more than 25%. The last time I looked, it's all about 20. They all seem to have about 20.
MK is tracking on 30, but maybe marginal error.
Something around about there. But so you've got to have a coalition government. That may be the condition to create, in other words, a national government may be the condition to create coalition governments at these two massively important provincial levels. That might be the trick here. So you sort of parlay your provincial support into a national government. And then, of course, is the method. So do you create a coalition government using that crowbar, as it were, to get yourself in there? And then how do you divide up the cake? Do you simply say one party will be heavy in administration of parliament, or do you say another will focus on the national executive? Do we have some sort of check and balance? Because the danger for all of us is that you have this kind of hodgepodge coalition running everything, and then everything becomes kind of shades of grey. So I shouldn't be saying that either in the nuclear Kirk. It just becomes a sort of blended, amorphous mass. Or do you allow one party to dominate in one area one party to lead in one province or another. And as it shakes out currently, you would think that the IFP would have the upper hand in such a grand coalition scenario in KZN. The DA would probably have the upper hand. I hear what you say about the EFF, but in Gauteng, probably make the residents of Gauteng a bit happier than they generally are. I live in Gauteng. And then then the rest of them shake out in a different way. So there's all sorts of scenarios. Now, here's one, which is, if Cyril gets below 50%, does he survive? Or does he have to do such a grand coalition deal to be able to maintain his position in the ANC? And is such a grand coalition, again, this phasing of it, the timing of it, how do you work it out? And then what role does a national dialogue play in all of this? And in conclusion, one would say the most likely scenario at this point is, if they get below 45, that there is some sort of coalition deal hammered together, both at the provincial and the national level. There's a sort of division of spoils in a grown-up way, which means doesn't involve Fikile and Balula. Sorry, it's a cheap shot. But then you have some sort of national dialogue to be able, sort of son of Kadesa or daughter of Kadesa, to kind of re-establish South Africanism and a unification in a way that enables us to use that as a platform to deal with some of these acute social issues.
Justice, of course, the problem with all of this lovely theory that Greg has just so eloquently explained to us is that this must happen in 2 weeks. Because the Constitution in Article 51(1) says 14 days after the declaration of the election results, which is scheduled to be around the Saturday or the Sunday after
the proclamation, so it will be by the Wednesday. So from the Wednesday, 2 weeks.
Okay, but we're talking about mid-June, right? Yeah. Where all these new elected MPs must go to Parliament in Cape Town, that's burned down, so the City Hall, and elect a president in 2 weeks. That all of this must happen. Yeah. I mean, is it even possible?
I think it's possible. I mean, it's interesting, Greg, what you spoke about, and it becomes personality. So I don't think actually that for Cyril Ramaphosa 46% or the ANC 46% is a loss. The ANC at 46% is, you know what, I'm going to sit down, and you spoke about him, Velenkosini Hlabisa of the IFP, and I will talk to him until I wear him down, that you're a good person, stability, all that, and it's coming. But that personality of Cyril Ramaphosa, if you take him out, and this week, the whole week, ANC people going around saying, look, he's still very popular. What was the survey, CDE or someone saying, he was at 57%, he's at 70s, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So in those 2 weeks, it's possible for the assembly to, so the EFF says Julius for president, and the DA says, bloody hell, no way. And someone says John Steenhuisen, and Julius and the ANC say no way. But around Cyril Ramaphosa, you can build, around the person of Cyril Ramaphosa, you can build a sort of consensus that you haven't seen. You can say, he's so mild-mannered, he's so sweet, he's so charming, he's so...
And he really is.
Incisive, he speaks so well.
He has such a nice pen.
Such a nice pen, and he's the Mandela generation, post-Mandela generation, and so forth. Cyril, much as with all his problems, is a figure around which you can elect him president without having a coalition in place. And that gives you time then for him to then play the chess master and say, who do I bring into this? The ANC already has a GNU of sorts. Patricia de Lille there's no reason for her to be in cabinet, but here are all these people very happy that she's bringing gazillions of tourists to the Western Cape. The ANC has played that before. Cyril was playing around with it. I think parties like the FF Plus I think the FF Plus will see a little uptick. And I think the FF Plus has never been, is very pragmatic about who am I, what are my interests, what's my constituency, and so forth.
You know, they voted with the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal for the mayor to buy 25 million rand cars.
Qaanitah, I want to,
That's what the plus stands for.
before we open for questions, which will be in a minute, so please get your question ready, your crisp question. Qaanitah, we're going to the polls in 11 days, all of us here. What do we need to think about when we vote? Don't tell us who we should vote for, because I know you won't do that.
Okay.
But also talk to us about the smaller parties, the new entrants. There's a larger menu this year to choose from, right? There's not only the steak and the chips and the fish and the chicken. There's sushi.
Buffet. So I want everyone here to start thinking about creating a funnel, right? So you create your personal funnel and say, what are my 5 election issues, right? Your 5 election issues and my 5 election issues are not going to be the same because you have kids. So education is more important to you. Education is not really important to me, right? Maybe foreign policy is important to me, but foreign policy is actually like the least thing on your concern. So create like, what are my 5 top tier issues? Even 3, if you like. Let's whittle it down, right? So for me, I'll tell you the economy, and then create a deal breaker list, right? A xenophobic party is a no for me. I'll tell you straight. So that eliminates a whole lot. So
We're left to the EFF.
but the point is that then you start applying your mind to fit political parties in your personal funnel, right? Because your lived experience, if you lived in Rondebosch, is I'm middle class, the party that governs here takes my trash, my life is pretty much okay. If I'm from Tembisa, the party that gives me 370 rand as an unemployed person, I'm scared that 370 rand, yes, I wish it could be more and I wish I had a job, but I'm scared that if I flirt with another political party, that 370 rand may be taken away from me, rationally or irrationally, right? And so understand how voting decisions are made in that way, that it's very personal and very tailored to you. And unfortunately, you cannot be romantic when it comes to political parties, because if you have to just take funding of political parties as a mechanism, do you want people who are funded by dodgy people or people who steal from the state? Like you have to choose your, So be a little bit. And then there's one other element that I must say. We have the introduction of a regional ballot this year. So basically, it means the 400 seats in the National Assembly is cut into half. 200, that's the national representative, 200 is a regional ballot, and then you have your provincial ballot, right? Think about options around where do I stay provincially, and then what are my considerations on a national level? And that's when you could possibly split your vote, if you like. So say, I like the people who run my province. We come from Gauteng, we probably don't.
Who runs our province?
Gautengers have PTSD on another level, Justice. But the point is that be a little bit more engaging this year. And just take a little bit of thought, even if it's while you're queuing to vote. Because I'm sure now we're all voting, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. And then the other point that I wanted to make, AB, is that understanding that voting is the least you can do in a participatory democracy. And I say it before and I'll say it again, like we are, it's a job interview. We're hiring people on the 29th of May. We're only hiring 870 people, 400 in the National Assembly, 400 and something in the provincial legislatures. Not that much, right? These are the people that must work for us for 5 years. And we'll never employ anybody and not check up on them periodically and just appoint them and walk away and think things are going to be fine. So if this election proves anything, it must just change the way we engage as voters.
Okay. Let's open up for questions. Thank you very much. Do you like the panelists? I see a hand there. If you can start there, please.
Thanks so much. This question is for all of the panelists, but I want to go back to two quick things that Qaanitah said earlier in the panel. Firstly, that, the ANC is going to be the biggest party after this election. And secondly, that, in the Eastern Cape, Free State, Limpopo, I think it was Mpumalanga, you also added, is their strong base. There's a clear connection there, right? That the ANC knows how to both be in rural provinces and be in rural areas and campaign. My basic question is, why doesn't anybody else figure that out? In the Western Cape, the DA did that to a certain extent. It's now starting to lose badly to Good and the PA in the rural Western Cape. I'm just trying to understand why opposition parties are so garbage, honestly, at talking to rural voters and basically leaving them right there and there for the ANC to scoop up. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Can I see that there's a hand there in the middle and then at the back as well? Let's take both those questions.
Exactly.
Sure.
Thanks. Someone this morning used the metaphor of a marriage around these coalitions. And I'm curious that we're talking about these coalitions as though marriages last forever. My question is, what do the panelists think are the risks to some of these coalitions? How soon are they going to fall apart? And what are the fault lines? Because they can rearrange every so often, whenever.
Thank you very much. And this on the other side. To the back of, yeah.
My question is around the DA. Does it even want to govern South Africa? As a Gauteng-based voter, I just don't see it. Is the DA just actually more interested in consolidating power in the Cape, or does it even want the job? And I would question that based on what they do as opposed to perhaps what some of the election posters say. And anyone can take that, although maybe Greg would be interesting given that you've written the scenarios book.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to divide these questions. So, Justice, may I ask you to take the rural question? Why is no one else campaigning in those big rural areas, and why is the ANC still the only show in town, or are they?
I think in large part the ANC is still the big show in town. Over the last 6 months, we've seen Rise Mzansi doing incredibly well with putting up its posters and so forth, but it hasn't done as much in the rural areas as all that. The ANC's power remains memory. A huge chunk of rural South Africa is of an age that still remembers apartheid. A huge chunk of urban South Africa is younger, looking for jobs, and has moved to urban South Africa. And that's part of the reason why you're seeing the ANC becoming pretty much like ZANU-PF. It has lost. You spoke first about Nelson Mandela Bay, Gauteng, Tshwane, city of Joburg, and so forth. I think the opposition has not worked hard enough in those areas to begin to show people that, look, this is part of it. I know that the idea of social grants is receding as a driver of voting patterns, but I think it's still very, very powerful. I think that in those rural areas, a child grant plus an old age pension of 2,100, sorry. I think those are real big issues. I think there's also a lot of misinformation and disinformation about whether if Qaanitah wins, if Greg wins, those are going to stay. And I think that fear-mongering is pushed hard by the ANC, particularly in rural areas.
Thank you very much. Qaanitah, coalition governments, are they like marriages? Can they start and end? And what would be the impact if a coalition government at national level is abruptly removed in a motion of no confidence after a few months?
It's not made to last, and the way it's designed and the way it's negotiated, there's absolutely no way. It's really a marriage of convenience, and the legislation is what worries us. We went to Europe, Adriaan and I, to understand what coalitions. You need legislation to make it last. How is that? You need a longer time period to negotiate it. You need to have a coalition agreement that's binding. We don't have that. We don't have. you can call a motion of no confidence whenever. So the president can go onto a flight and go to New York for the UN General Assembly, and when he's somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, he can be recalled. He really can, and so I don't think that the government or the agreements negotiated in the 2 weeks post-elections is going to carry us for 5 years. I don't have for a second believe that. Even if it's a grand coalition, I think there will be maneuverings along the way, because we've seen from 2016 till now, and we've seen it on the part of all political parties. There's not one flip-flop, but they all flip-flop.
And that's why ultimately we need strong institutions and a strong state to carry on governing while the politicians...
Yeah, but why is it that Paul Mashatile has been leading this process in Parliament to do exactly this, to give us the legislation that's very clear, to give us guardrails so that we don't have what happened. And the MPs did nothing about it. Instead, you see all these legislation being signed into law when what we need and what would prevent a huge amount of uncertainty in the period after May 29. Actually, the work has not been done. So essentially, you've just put a huge chunk of risk in the middle of June, July, probably, and into the future. So it's a problem. It's the same people we're going to vote for.
Greg, does the DA want to govern South Africa?
Well, you'd have to ask them, but
according to your sources.
Of course they do. I sometimes sort of despair with South Africans sort of holding oppositions to different standards as they do the ANC. And they over-personalize this. I hear it particularly from the demographic overwhelmingly represented in this room. I don't like that person. Well, it's got nothing to do with liking them. It's got everything to do with whether they represent your interests. And you need to approach politics with the same cold-eyed way that politicians approach you. Of course they do. Of course they want to rule South Africa or run South Africa. Perhaps it's a better term. And let me end with this, because you wanted us to end with a message of hope. If South Africa votes in the ANC again, I don't think there's any reason to believe that our governance is going to change to any notable degree. If there is a coalition, there's every possibility that governance, as opposed to policy, could change. And in fact, without a strong opposition, you're not going to have a coalition. You're simply not going to have a coalition. And the hope for South Africa is, as I said, in those two provinces, KZN and Gauteng, that there's a big coalition, not these fractious small things. And we often think of coalitions in South Africa because, the media wants us to think that. These are fractious, they're failures. There's more than 30 coalitions at the municipal level that actually work pretty well. We look at the failures and we say they don't work. They tend to be the larger metros where they're not like a marriage, they're more like Tinder. And in Tinder, there's always somebody getting, I can't say that word in the NG Kirk, but at least that's what I'm told. And it's not these not relationships meant to last. These are not long-term relationships founded on values. The big difference with the MPC, and we haven't spoken about it that much, is that they signed people up to values before the election. So they had to agree on a bunch of stuff. And those parties that couldn't agree on that bunch of stuff, we can argue about whether they should have or shouldn't have agreed, or it should be different stuff as to what they should have agreed to. If they didn't agree to that, they couldn't be part of that coalition. It's the basis, it's the rump around which you build coalitions. If your reason for building a coalition is simply power, it's going to fall apart.
Yeah.
If your reason for building a coalition is that you want a different South Africa, that you share a bunch of values, that you have a similar governance outlook, then there's every chance that it could continue. Last point. But those smaller parties in the coalition, and by here I mean IFP potentially, or others in the MPC in a coalition, even the EFF and MK, if it was to come to that, they have to be very careful themselves of not being swallowed up. And somebody here mentioned ZANU-PF. The great lesson out of Zimbabwe, where I spent far too much time working, is that the MDC was swallowed up ultimately in 2013 after doing all the hard work in stabilizing Zimbabwe, getting rid of the Zim dollar, dollarizing the economy, getting it back onto a growth footing, 4 years of non-stop growth, and then they were swallowed up and spat out. They had failings themselves. They became used to the trappings of power. All sorts of things went wrong in the MDC itself. But it is a salutary lesson that for the smaller parties and coalitions, they've also got to mind their own interests and remember those values as to why they went into it in the first instance.
Well, it's all going to play out over the next 11 days. Thank you so much to Greg, Justice, and Qaanitah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adriaan.
I've been doing it.